Name and nature, who do you say that I am? The question was asked by Christ himself, as you know, of his apostles. And as a result of the answer that Peter gave, he began to teach them that Calvary was on its way. I want you to begin, if you wouldn't mind, by imagining the edge of water. A quayside by the sea or by a lake, could be both. Kittybags, or the most beautiful place on earth, Achill Island. And imagine a group of men sitting together mending nets. You could also situate this, of course, on the Lake of Galilee. And I want to start with a poem of mine, which is called Edge of the Known World. Hours they spend stitching nets along the quayside, these slow, warm days. It is a time to cast into the light such goblets of wisdom the older ones have harvested. Time for the young to offer mockeries. It seems they have been forever sitting there, baiting words. Their lives are complex interactions of rope lines with small squares of air, that their days may hold, that bounty be a little more assured. All this at the earth's edge, the old unyielding ground, asserting ocean's limitations, one eye on the hemp, one on the fluidity and refusal of the sea. They knot patience and hope together, the windy vowels of their humour and spittled consonants of their expletives. In that place where Christ walks by and throws their consciousness into chaos with his demands. What are the demands put to us by the encounter with Christ? We are filled with questions. There was a little known poet called Phineas Fletcher, who wrote roughly around 1600, a poem that he called The Divine Lover, in which he outlines how his personal consciousness was thrown into chaos. And here's just the first stanza of that poem. The Divine Lover. Me, Lord, canst thou misspend one word, misplace one look on me? Call'st me thy love, thy friend? Can this poor soul the object be of these love glances, these life-kindling eyes? What? I, the centre of thy arms' embraces, of all thy labour, I the prize? Love never mocks, truth never lies. Oh, how I quake. Hope, fear, fear, hope displaces. I would, but cannot hope. Such wondrous love amazes. Fine questions, I think, which we would all assent to as questions. Christianity forms a deep and lasting background to our Western culture and has done so for countless generations. It's a window through which we look at life, and that window may well be coloured, stained, and sometimes darkened. Western culture for centuries took the Christian myth as a bridge between two worlds, earth and heaven. Walk carefully across that bridge and you will make it. In our time, however, that bridge has collapsed. And now, how do we find our way? If we have clung tightly to the myth, do we now cast it off completely, or do we see if it can be redeemed? Can we face the fact that a changing, evolving world might demand a different view of Christ? That what we think we already know about Jesus may well be false, pushing the truth into a cul-de-sac. All the theology, the churches, the learning, the arguments, we have absorbed so much at home, at school, in church. All of it may do little more than remove any real hope we may have for what I'm interested in, which is a personal approach to the person of Jesus Christ. And if Jesus Christ is not known as someone I can relate to, someone for me, pro me, then he is not real to me. And Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? What is it then in us that responds to our view of who and what Jesus is? And if we know where our response comes from, accepted imagery and explanations, or personal meditation on the person of Jesus, then we may perhaps begin to know him properly. That is, if there is such a thing as properly. For perhaps each individual must respond in an individual way, like the Samaritan woman at the well, questioning Jesus, or Zacchaeus climbing a sycamore tree to get a better look at him, and as a consequence for both of these characters, coming to a change of the way in which they lived. Another wee poem. This one is called Samaria, and I think it speaks for itself, and it's a poem of mine I want to come back to much later on, 4 hours later into this talk. Samaria. Jacob's well, Shechem, route of nomads, revolt, crusade, of people toiling down valleys of silence into exile. She, drawing near, heart torn by love failures, drawing near to the source now, the sustenance, the stranger waiting, out of Exodus and Genesis with demanding words. Between them, issues of time, of history, the depths of the iced-over, petrified heart. I thirst. Who then is keeper of the soul in need, he or she? Between them, between past and future, the clarity of water in the moment of its giving. Words echoing beyond the sounds of words, beyond clanging of consonant or bird call of vowel. How the heart in its taut holding wants to yield to the presence, to the immediacy. She, later returning home, stumbles, her pitchers full. He stays on the ridge of stone, staring down into the deep, till the moon brightens down there in the uttermost darkness. The value of the story in many ways is that it's a two-way contact, as personal contact must be. And in this case, I wonder, who is the inquisitor and who is being quizzed? Right, into other poems that offer the personal approach. Some of these you may know and some you don't, I would reckon. One of them is called David Gascoigne. Lived in the Isle of Wight, died maybe 20 years ago. A surrealist, one of the only English surrealists. Changed from communism to Catholicism. Wrote a wonderful poem called Ecce Homo. I'm only going to give you the first stanza of that. He asks, whose is this horrifying face? This putrid flesh, discoloured, flayed, fed on by flies, scorched by the sun? Whose are these hollow, red-filmed eyes, and thorn-spiked head, and spear-stuck side? Behold the man. He is man's son. And here's a piece from Denise Levertov, a convert to Catholicism very late in her life. But listen to this as a personal approach to Christ, or God. tyrant God, cruel God, heartless God. God who permits the endless outrage we call history. Deaf God, blind God, idiot God, scapegoat God. Finally, running out of accusations, we deny your existence. A theologian called Irenaeus of Lyon. I'm hopping from contemporary poetry, as you can see, back to other players in the game. Towards the end of the 2nd century, put the myth succinctly and says, you know this, it was for this end that the Word of God was made man, and he who was the Son of God became the Son of man, that man, having been taken into the Word and receiving the adoption, might become the Son of God. For by no other means could we have attained to incorruptibility and immortality, unless we had been united to incorruptibility and immortality. So the Christ was more than a social revolutionary, more than someone standing for justice, solidarity, peace, liberation. By forgiving sins, he made himself into God's son. And for 2 millennia, the West has had its cultural roots nourished by that myth. Pope Benedict, in his book Jesus of Nazareth, begins his approach to who and what Jesus Christ is with the truth of the incarnatus est, God's entry into human history. The person of Jesus Christ is the source and exemplar of our faith. And Ratzinger says, the disciple who walks with Jesus is caught up with him into communion with God. All of this seems obvious, but I do not believe it has been so, because we have been led to hold on to so much stuff we were given. How then do we walk with Jesus? In the first letter of John, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. Tactile, sensual, awareness. A poet does not care to offer prescriptions for living. It is the poet's task, particularly as a Christian poet, to experience, to offer sensual alertness and awareness, not dogmas. Paul wrote, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." So I see poet and prophet as almost interchangeable terms. A poet is therefore a prophet, and a prophet is a poet. And we're talking all the time here about good poets and good prophets, and good prophet poets and good poet prophets. And there aren't that many of them around. The encounter with Jesus, as in the Samaritan woman, is a two-way process. It's gentle but insistent from one side, and from the other it becomes an opening into self-awareness. The closed mind is a phrase I associate with a militant, atheistic approach to life. It's a mind that allows little or no space for an open-ended view of being. A mind that also appears closed off to the wilderings of the imagination, in other words, to poetry. It's a mind I would equate with closed-circuit television, an inward-looking view of things, egoistic in a truly pejorative sense. And society at our time seems to be basking in a closed mind. Take the recent statements in January of this year by our Minister for Education, Rory Quinn. He, above all, as Minister for Education, should, one would think, have an open mind. But when he was asked at a conference of the Irish Primary Principals Network how he would find 30 minutes of additional time to implement his initiatives, he replied, "I would like it to be out of the 30 minutes a day for religious education." In such a context, he went on to suggest that he wanted to offer greater choice, to reflect a greater diversity of people in a more pluralist society. But he was actually advocating quite the opposite to all of that. The closed mind. It is what poetry and literature, indeed the arts in general, have been fighting for forever. Who do you say that I am? Adélia Prado is a contemporary Brazilian woman poet, and she has written a very sensual poetry that she has come up with. She said, "I found God more deeply in poetry than in doctrine." And in another poem she writes, "I discover that I have never seen the true face of God. There are women in my circle who pray joylessly and can recite the entire book from top to bottom, including the copyright, the list of editions, the preface, and an address to report answered prayers. All I want is to say, 'Oh, beauty, I adore you. My entire body trembles at your look.'" So, a poet does not have to necessarily know the dictionary by heart, but the imagination has to be free and has to be opened. True poetry is not achieved by knowing the dictionary. It can come from studying, as Yeats said, monuments of its own magnificence, and by what Simone Weil called paying attention, attending. And here's a poem by R.S. Thomas, late great Welsh poet, called "The Moor." "It was like a church to me. I entered it on soft foot, breath held like a cap in the hand. It was quiet. What God there was made himself felt, not listened to, in clean colours that brought a moistening of the eye, in a movement of the wind over grass. There were no prayers said, but stillness of the heart's passions. That was praise enough, and the mind's session of its kingdom. I walked on, simple and poor, while the air crumbled and broke on me generously as bread." Again, what I'm emphasizing is the sensual, the physical awareness as opposed to doctrinal or dogma. Siobhan very kindly said that she got angry if I'm ever referred to as a landscape poet. I'm a landscape poet, of course, because I was born in the most beautiful part of the world, which I say, of course, without bias or prejudice, Achill Island. I get very cross. No, I don't get very cross. But I don't like being called a religious poet. And I dislike the term religious poetry. I did an interview with Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and now Doctor, a Master of Magdalen College, which takes over from last week's wonderful talk by another Master of Magdalen College. And one of the things I spoke to Rowan Williams about was precisely this term, religious poetry. And he fought me, no, he didn't fight me, he fought with me against the term. And I suggested possible alternatives. Spiritual poetry is not right. And I suggested faith poetry. And he replied, faith, yes. That would work better for me than religious, because religious poetry strikes me as poetry written to subserve religious purposes. That can't be it. Yes, a poetry of faith, just as a poetry of eros, a poetry of vision. You want to talk about a poetry that is rooted in one of the central aspects of our being human. Having faith is a central aspect of being human, just like erotic attachment, just like a vision of the world around us, just like having a hope in the future, all of that. And to me, a poetry that is, say, religiously significant is a poetry that works as poetry out of that sort of human depth. And I mentioned Rowan Williams, and I will come back to him and to the Samaritan lady. Not together, but separate. When you admit to a loss of faith, it has to be asked, what then was that faith? What did you believe in? What and who was that God that held you attached for so long? Now, I was brought up on Achill Island in what I might call the old faith. It was an island faith, an isolated faith, an isolated Roman Catholic faith. And I hope that no matter how negative that was, that I have not thrown it over, but thought it through and found a base in it to which I still cling. Perhaps a return to a real and living faith is the essential element of lifting us out of the muddy and murky place where we are now wallowing as a nation and as a world. And today and these last few days exemplify the muddiness and the murkiness where we are living. I wrote a poem that tries to catch the way I was brought up, the simplicity of it, the gentleness of it, the love of it. And I associate that with the faith in which I was brought up. I do not advocate a return to the techniques and technology employed by my father in cutting a small field of hay, in the same way that I don't advocate a return to that kind of faith. But it is associated with a world that was not evolving. Cadenza. There was something major key about the scythe, with father's big boned body slow waltzing to the rhythm. Cadenza, making meadow music, no rain expected. The landrail, its hidden signature, had time to crake and urge her untuned chicks to safety down into the ditch. There was time, too, for last year's souls, with a soft moan, to exhale themselves to sky before windrows, shakings, hayricks rose in choir and lightly hymned in harvest. We found surprising the hair tufts on father's chest, a kind of harvest too. Mother's levity with the long rake was a revelation, and the humblebee's sweet wild honey discovered in the stubble. We believed, and there was no question, in Eve and Adam, the beauty of Ruth in a field gleaning, and the Magdalene turning in the garden towards inexpressible joy. That God I was introduced to and lived with for so very long was, in theological terms, and I had to look it up, and I have to look it up several times, again, these difficult theological terms, was an apophatic God. A God whose attributes were all classified as negative. It was a God remote, unreal, impersonal, depending on the rules and regulations of the church to which one was attached. It was Greek metaphysics that influenced the West to speak of God in such negative terms. What God was not, according to pure reason. God as immutable, free from suffering and passion. In my early days of faith, God was not a God of actual history. He was a Greek abstraction, a philosophical thesis, ineffable, unbegotten, without origin. We did not have a living God, and therefore we had no evolving tradition. We had a theistic theory. Who do you say that I am? I'm not going to cover the whole of literary history, or even poetry history when it comes to this. There is a vast history of faith poetry, and I have studied a great deal of it, always conscious of the fact that none of the poems answer the question, who do you say that I am? Emphasizing, who do you say that I am? They always skirt the person because they write out of a given tradition. For instance, way back in the 8th century, one of the most beautiful Anglo-Saxon poems to appear from that tradition is called The Dream of the Rood. I'm sure you know of it. It's very beautiful. If you're watching the Vikings on television, you will know that people kill each other because that's the thing to be done at a particular time. Everybody does it, so let's do it. In the Anglo-Saxon Dream of the Rood tradition, the hero was the most important in society. So the poet makes the cross itself, the physical cross, the speaker of this particular poem. And Christ comes and voluntarily offers himself and becomes the hero. So it's a beautiful poem, but written out of that specific tradition. There's the distancing in making the cross speak. There is the distancing in using the tradition to get the poet's view across. Here's a little bit from it. The hero stripped, though he was God Almighty. It's the cross that's speaking. Though he was God Almighty, robust and resolute, mounting onto the gallows, spirited in the sight of many to redeem mankind. I wavered while the warrior embraced me, clasped me, and I did not dare bend down towards the ground or fall on the earth's surface. I must stand fast. I was raised up a rood, carrying the powerful King, High Lord of Heaven, and did not dare to bend. They pierced me with bloody nails, the pain still stings, the open wounds of malice. They made us fools together. I was wholly wet with blood streaming from his side when he gave up his soul, and helpless on that hill I knew a fearful fate. Stretched out in agony, the Almighty God of hosts cruelly racked. The heavens all in spate above the body of our ruler, that bright radiance. Shadows reigned supreme under a thickening cloud, and all of creation mourned and moaned this cruel chance. And Christ was on the rood. Here's a phrase from a modern theologian, German Cardinal Walter Casper. He says, Jesus Christ is not only the final self-definition of God, but the final definition of world and man. And here's a passage from chapter 1 of Colossians. Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. Now I want to skip some centuries because no great poetry in this tradition was written, even by our friend William Shakespeare or Chaucer or any of these guys, until early 17th century, when there was a great flowering of faith, because faith was being challenged. The troubles between Catholicism and Protestantism. And once something is being troubled, the poets come to the rescue. And there's a great list of very, very powerful poets who write delightful faith poetry. John Donne, Robert Herrick, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, many more, right up into John Milton. And Milton provides us with a wonderful cul-de-sac folly him. You can't. He came to a kind of an end. Out of that splendid era, however, you go through all of those poems, try and find for me a personal response to the person of Jesus Christ. And what I've been trying to say through all these quotations up to now is to point out the importance for true faith of that approach, of that awareness, to make it personal, to have a personal response. The closest to come to it, there are little bits here and there. John Donne, Good Friday, 1613, riding westward, has touches of it, of a really good, honest to God personal response. John Donne, through his humour and his wit and the language that he uses, his metaphors, distances himself all the time, except, again, he approaches close to it when he's on his deathbed. The closest one to come persistently to it was George Herbert, one of my favourite poets. And my favourite poem, perhaps of all time, is one called Love, which you all know without a shadow of a doubt. We know that Christ dined with sinners and bad people like tax collectors and poets and such like drunkards and prostitutes and all of that stuff. And dined with them and wanted to dine with them. George Herbert's poem doesn't call it Christ, doesn't say Jesus. He uses the phrase love, which is grand. We know what he means. He means all of it. Because this could be a fully secular poem in its own way. Love. Inviting somebody, come on in. The fullness of invitation. And the soul, if you like, says, no, I'm not worthy. And there's that wonderful phrase, I'm guilty of dust as well as sin. I'm a sinner, but as well as that, I'm a human being, and I'm just made of dust. So no. But the little drama develops that the soul is drawn in closer and closer and closer until it yields at the very end. It's a beautiful, lovely poem, ever so slightly skirting the personal. Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes, but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, said Love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, said Love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Delightful in its simplicity and in its fullness. And what I like, I think, most about it is that little phrase, my dear, I cannot look on thee. And later on it says, mightier than I will serve. Little phrase that my next beautiful poet took up, Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poet who loved his Christ and wrote many beautiful faith poems. But again, if you read him from the perspective that I'm talking about, where is this absolute personal response in the poems to the person of Jesus Christ? He uses, my dear, in one of the poems, which is an echo of Herbert. The closest he comes to something like that is in the Wreck of the Deutschland, that supremely wonderful, powerful poem. But here it begins, in fact, with the encounter with a God who is not a personal God, but who is a cosmic creature. The poem begins, "Thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread, world's strand, sway of the sea, Lord of living and dead, thou hast bound bones and veins in me, fastened me flesh. But after it, almost unmade, what with dread thy doing? And dost thou touch me afresh? Over again, I feel thy finger and find thee." That is not a personal God, that is a cosmic creature. And of course the poem goes on to talk about the nun calling upon Christ to come and save them from a wreck. And it is Hopkins talking, but it's the nun that talks and calls upon Christ. Later on in his life, Hopkins came to Dublin and did not enjoy the experience, I'm sure you know. Suffered and died here. And I think he suffered a form of depression as well as the illness which has been argued about. When he was in Dublin and suffering under such pain, he appealed to the person of Christ in those, what they call the terrible sonnets, which do come close to a personal appeal. But that's what it is. It's an appeal. It's not a personal response. Here's a little bit from the blackest of those poems. "I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, or what black hours we have spent this night. What sighs you, heart, saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away." So I skip from there over people like T.S. Eliot, who made a virtue of non-personal, to continue my search until I came across the first poem that really caught me by the throat as a personal response to the person of Jesus. And it was written by a very close friend of mine, and who's an Augustinian priest living in Dublin, and whom I expected to see here tonight. He's called Padraig J. Daly. And this is a poem of his which touches with a vengeance on the personal. It's called The Voice of the Hare. He's a priest and had just come away from terrible suffering that he had seen in the family. "I will tell you, sir, about a woman of yours who suddenly had all her trust removed and turned to the wall and died. I remember how she would sing of your love, rejoice in your tiniest favour. The scented jonquils, the flowering currant bush, the wet clay spoke to her unerringly of benevolence. I remind you, sir, of how, brought low, she cowered like a tinker's dog, her hope gone, her skin loose about her bones. Where were you, sir, when she called out to you? And where was the love that height nor depth nor any mortal thing can overcome? Does it please you, sir, that your people's voice is the voice of the hare torn between the hounds?" It's the anger and immediacy of that appellation, "sir," repeated through the poem, that brought me up short. Can you speak to Christ like that? The poem is a very strong one, and I would go so far as to say it's a great poem. And it led me to thinking of the possibility in an evolving world of finding new poetry that would underline and underpin an evolving faith. And here, as they say, he departs from his typed text to make it a little bit more personal. As Siobhan said, I was the founder of Poetry Ireland and of its magazine, the Poetry Ireland Review, which is true. And for the last 8 issues, I have been editing the Poetry Ireland Review from issue number 105 to now 112. I was born on Achill Island, basically in the shadow of Kilpatrick, but I never climbed Kilpatrick. If you're born by the sea, you don't bother learning to swim. Because you say, well, I'll do it next year. I climbed Kilpatrick for the first time, and now for the only time, at the age of 68, and I made it with enormous difficulty to the top, and made it with even more enormous difficulty back down again. But halfway up, you come to the saddle. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I sat down and rested for a while and wondered would I go on or not. And I looked up, and the top half of the mountain was now covered in mist, and the rain was coming in, and I could see nothing. So there was a huge temptation to give it up, to come home and say, oh yeah, sure, made it to the top, great view, oh wonderful. But I didn't. I carried on, and I found it enormously difficult, and I kept saying to myself, what in the name am I doing this for? And more or less, when I got right to the top and managed to find the church, which I found it very difficult to do in that mist, I leaned back against the wall, and I thought I heard deep down in my soul that call, who do you say that I am? In other words, what am I doing up there? And a further thought came to me. Okay, I'm editing the Poetry Ireland Review. I'm going to ask people that I know to write new poems for me on this topic. Name and nature. Who do you say that I am? Would you do that for me? And I wrote to all the poets that no, I didn't yet. I was going to write to all the poets that I knew. I said, that's a nice idea. And then I said, no, it's not. It's not. It's a stupid idea. They're going to think I'm an idiot. I'm going to get stick because you're not supposed to do that kind of thing in high literature circles. So I said I'll ask somebody if they think it's a good idea. And if that person thinks it's a good idea, I'll go ahead with it. And I wrote to Rowan Williams, whom I had known already. And he wrote back at once saying what a wonderful idea that is. And I wrote to Seamus Heaney, and he wrote back and said it's about time somebody did that. So I said, okay, here goes. And that was in the last month of 2011. I have now got everything together, and it will be coming out in number 112 of the Poetry Ireland Review, the end of April. And I have poems from wonderful people, about 60 different poets from all over the world, including Padraig J. Daly, some of them, these names you might not know, Christian Wyman, an American, Thomas Kinsella, Gillian Clark. I have an essay from Enda McDonough. We have Thomas McCarthy, American poet called Wendell Berry. Another wonderful essay on why Rilke's poetry drove him into the monastery by Mark Patrick Hederman. Poems by Michael Longley, Ruth Padel, a lovely essay by Conor McDonough, even a little chunk, especially written, called Name and Nature, by the novelist Colin McCann. I'm only going to read one of those for you now. A poem that has not been heard or seen before. And that joins up what Dr. Casey is doing from last week, which we had a wonderful talk on Seamus Heaney. This is the poem that Seamus Heaney gave me, and I think it must be, if not the last, then second or third last, because he had at this stage said that he had lost all faith in the afterlife. But I said, well, what about my poem? He said, oh no, I'm working on that. You'll have it. So he sent me a version of it, and I liked it enormously. And I said, great. And then he sent me another version of it, which had changed slightly. And in this one, he talks again about the stroke that he had that left him paralyzed. And as you may know, he did use the imagery from the New Testament of Christ and the 4 people coming to allow to drop the paralytic man down in front of him. He used that image before in the poem. But if you listen carefully to this one, it is the same imagery used, but this time it is the poet prophet. In fact, this time it is the poet Jesus, and it is the Jesus poet. And the Jesus poet, as well as being Jesus, is in fact Seamus Heaney, which makes this quite a unique piece, I think, in his opus. The latecomers. He saw them come, then halt behind the crowd that wailed and clucked and ringed him, and was glad they kept their distance. Hedged on every side, harried and responsive to their need, each hand that stretched, each brief hysteric squeal. However he assisted and paid heed, a sudden blank letdown was what he'd feel, unmanning him, when he met the pain of loss in the eyes of those his reach had failed to bless. And so he was relieved. The newcomers had now discovered they'd arrived too late and gone away, until he hears them, climbers on the roof, the sound of tiles being shifted, the treble scrape of terracotta lifted, and a paralytic on his pallet lowered like a corpse into a grave. Exhaustion and the imperatives of love vied in him to judge, instruct, reprove, and ease them, body and soul, not to abandon, but to lay on hands, make time, make whole, forgive. I want to finish with one of my own poems, if you'll allow me to do this. I have not put one into this anthology, because I believe an anthologist does not put self into an anthology. But I said, I'll get a chance. Ursula and I went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land under the gentle and sublime guidance of one Brendan McConvery, to whom I will be forever grateful for the vision that was allowed. One of the things that we did was take a boat out on Lake Galilee. So we're back to Lake Galilee where we began. Beautiful sunny day as we set out. But Brendan had arranged things so well that right in the middle of the lake, a storm. And we all got drenched, but made it across. We got on our bus and went from there back around the edge of the lake towards Tiberias, where our hotel was. On the left-hand side, we passed ruins of somewhere that was fenced off. So we asked, what's that? And they said, well, we think it's a little town known as Magdala at that time. We said, oh, can we stop and go down there? I'd love to see that. They said, no, we have to keep going. Can't go down there. For the rest of that trip, I had a kind of a living vision, which I wrote down much later. And in this vision, my father appears. It was, I think it was either the 17th or the 18th of March that we were there. And my father had been born on the 16th and had died in 1991. So I was thinking of him. My brother Declan was a Jesuit priest who died in California in 2010. He had been a severe alcoholic, but had overcome that and was living wonderfully full life out in California. He also protested outside San Quentin anytime there was an execution going to happen, where he was harried and hustled for being there, and it was the only time he wore the collar just to show that he was a Catholic priest. The rest of the time he didn't. This is all background information. At the same time, I discovered a book by a man called Willis Barnstone, wonderful scholar, classical scholar, Greek scholar, Hebrew scholar, Aramaic, had been personal secretary to the poet from the blind poet whose name I'm not going to remember right now. So he had Spanish and many other languages. And he has published a thing on the New Testament called the Restored New Testament. So using the original names and place names and personal names of that time, the original time, in which Jesus becomes Yeshua, in which Mary is Miriam, in which Magdala is Magdil, and in which my name is the beautiful, melodic Yohanan, rather than the brick-heavy, one-syllable John. So I like to be called Yohanan. Yohanan F. Deane. Also, the name of our bus driver on that coach, this is true, was Israel. No, I'm wrong. No, I'm right. And the name of the guide was Abraham. So we were in good hands. This is the poem. It was in March of that year. It's a kind of a vision poem, or if you go back to the Irish literature tradition in poetry, it's an ashling poem. It is March. In Ireland, daffodils will be suffering the harshest winds. Here, the coach has turned back from the slopes of the Beatitudes towards Tiberias. To the right, the galleys, the valleys, green and flush, rising to the hills. To the left, the lake, quietened, in an evening lull and pleasuring. I settled in my seat, comforted and tired, when, and this is my wakeful dream, this is the happening, this is real. In the coach seats opposite, father, fisherman and March month birthday boy, and brother, Declan, impatient God lover, picketer by the gates of San Quentin, celebrant of falling free at last from alcohol addiction. Both of them in animated conversation, both of them dead for years and months. They spoke in a language without words, song-like, seductive. Outside, darkness was falling early, the sun a dying fire, light catching on the thorn of the moon that was lying idle in a sapphire-shaded heaven. Soon there would be shimmering silver nightways out across the sea. Father suddenly called to me and pointed. The bus stopped, and we stepped down, we three only. Silently, they walked across the grass, down towards the shore. Drawn, confused, I followed. The light so faint now, all was shadow. Father, old friend and faithful. Declan, brother and priest. The old man turned to me and smiled. We, he said, we are not in death. We are in life. He pointed. There was another standing near the lake, her back to us. She was watching out over the water, frail-boned, slight but firm. Mother? I said. And she turned, slowly. I did not know her. Fair-skinned, handsome, but not beautiful. Your name? I asked. Miriam, she said. Miriam of Magdala. And yours? Yohanan, I answered, to my surprise. Around us, ruins only, excavations, stone heaps, stumps. Magdala? It was here, she said. He stepped ashore from the fishing boat and stood a while gazing towards the hills. I was kneeling there by that great rock. I was gutting fish for salting. I worried for his feet, naked against the sharp edges of the shells. The others, fishermen, moved awkwardly, hauling the boat ashore, uncertain of themselves. And who are you? I asked him, though I already knew the answer. He is the way. He is the life. And his truth will sear both soul and body. And he said, Miriam, as if he knew me. If I give, he said, word of myself, what can that be to you? Come and see. And I left fish and shore, lake and village, and followed him. He is invasion, hero, mystery. He is the center. He is forgiveness, light. And now I, she said, I am in death no longer. I am in life. She smiled, turning back towards the sea. I glanced for father, brother, but they were not there. And when I turned again, she, too, had disappeared. I shivered suddenly, alone and cold. A black-backed gull, perched on the great rock, was stabbing down at some small, feathered thing. Now it was night. From the road, Abram was calling out to me. And I came back, at peace, heavy in flesh, but free. Thank you very much for
very rooted understanding of Christianity, Catholicism, went on sort of a tour of India, various ashrams, E. Griffiths, who tried to integrate understanding of Hinduism and Christianity. And I've sort of, at this point, sort of so many years on, I just see the whole Christian imagery and religious imagery as being, as he called it, mythology, and finding meaning within that. And you know, you travel the world and see these fantastic cathedrals and see how it's a huge imprint, so many generations, and ultimately is not true.
Well, that's a wonderful statement, it's not true.
Well, no, what's true, you know, of course. Yeah.
Well, I can't tell you what's true, and you can't tell me what's not true.
Exactly, yeah, no, that's, and I just, where I reached a point where you cut the part of the closed circuit, actually believe everything and nothing simultaneously.
Precisely. Precisely. Yeah. I don't know where I am at this stage.
I don't really know.
No. But I think the important thing is that you're asking the questions.
Oh, yeah.
If you come up with the answers, you're wrong.
I know. Yeah,
so, I think the important thing is to keep asking the questions and keep hoping. And
I'm not even asking questions. Just be.
Just be. One of the great things that the imagination and imaginative people, prayerful people, I think, contemplatives should do, is listen more, rather than read or talk or so on. Just stop and listen. Language. Listen to the interior language and listen to poetry. Read more poetry.
Too much thought can create problems.
Of course it does, yes. Of course it does, I agree completely with you. But don't say yet.
Oh no, I'm not saying anything absolutely.
If you go off into the next world and then you find out that there's nothing happening up there in that you're you're a stone. Come back and tell us. And even then, as God himself said in the Lazarus, if they don't believe in Jesus Christ, they're not going to believe something came back from the dead either. So there ain't no answer.
I really liked Healy's poem about the paralytics. But one thing that always I asked myself, what happened to the 4 guys after they brought the man to Jesus? And while you were talking, I just got an inspiration. And I wrote a half a verse. I'd just like to read it for you. One said, he's okay now. Let's go have a drink. That's what he would like. We want no thanks. We only did our duty. You inspired me to write that.
Thank you. You can be sure that at least one of the 4 will say that's going to have a jar. I had never actually thought of that, but Seamus Healy has actually, in some other poem, or is it a dedication to a poem or a book, he has thanked the 4 people, or the people who actually did help him get into the ambulance and get him to a hospital fast. So he would certainly be aware of those other 4, of the 4 that did that particular act. I mean, there are so many questions you'd love to ask about people in the New Testament stories. What became of them? Who did what? You know, what about the guy who carried the cross for a while and then went off? You know, we hear no more of him. Endless questions again, and no answers. Keeps us on our toes. Thank you for that. That was lovely.
John, how would you rate the poetry of Mary Oliver?
I like Mary Oliver's work up to a point. I think it's a little bit simplistic and writing out of a tradition that is wholly accepted, and she doesn't challenge it very much. But she interprets it beautifully, I think. And you know, that's fine. But there's no challenges in her work, and I like a poetry that challenges a wee bit. She's a comforting writer, and she's very clever as well. And I do like the stuff. I like her work.
I'd like to say, first of all, thank you very much for sharing that last poem of yours with us. It was a very, very moving poem and stirred a lot of thoughts. When you started your talk, I also linked what this man said. I thought of a child that I taught in primary school in Crumlin, and the story for the religion was this: a 10-year-old, the Samaritan woman, and then there was an exercise the children had to follow. And she said, before the woman met Jesus, she felt like a good-for-nothing piece of rubbish thrown out. But afterwards, she was different, because he said to her, don't listen to what they're saying, only listen to your own heart.
Very bright. It's astonishing what the innocence and the unclosed mind will come up with. Yes. One also wonders, of course, what happened to the Samaritan woman afterwards. But she was excited and she told everybody, so she became a missionary straight away.
I was wondering how you would John of the Cross's spiritual encounter, how would that fit into your view?
John of the Cross is one of these people that is like a god. He's too good, especially if you can read him in Spanish. He's overwhelmingly good. I love the On a Dark Night in Una Noche Oscura, and I made an attempt to. One of the first poems I ever wrote was a turning of that poem on its head. So I like John of the Cross enormously in the poetry. I can't follow him or Teresa of Avila or Augustine or these full forwards, these Brian O'Driscolls of theology and all that. And again, they are interpreting, but beautifully and wonderfully, what is given. And in our day and age, I think we need to not shed all of that, but reinterpret for our age. So I don't read much of that in these days. Into the contemporary stuff far more, because each generation needs to retranslate for its generation. And by translate, I mean moving one thing into another area. So moving, in our time, the Christian tradition into one that interprets our age instead of just damning our age.
As you were talking there and reflecting on our society and the Minister for Education and what happened this week, I'm not too sure what you're talking about. Are you talking about what's happening over there in the East, or what happened politically with Alan Shatter and all that stuff?
All of it.
There seems to be a lot of knives around and people trying to bring other people down. I was thinking of Dominic Crossan in his first book. He's a theologian who has a book called The Dark Interval, a story as theology as story. And he has 5 types: myth, which establishes world; apology, which defends world; story, which explores world; satire, which purifies world; and then parable, which destroys world, leaving us open for a new myth or a new story. And I sense we're there at the moment. A myth has been exploded out of the water, we'll say, with all the scandals in the church and all that. And we're here at a time between a story we once took fully aboard and now it's been shattered, and we're waiting for something new to happen. And I think poetry has its role there. And I think that's maybe what you're trying to do, because a little bit like Heaney, you share the shattering, but you also want to let something new emerge and encourage others to do that. That's what I would see your work at the moment. Would I be right?
Yes, yes. With the one caveat that the myth has been perhaps exploded, but the basis of the myth remains. That is, I suppose, the essence of a myth, that it is universal and eternal. It's the incidentals that change and that move away. Again, last week's talk on Seamus spoke about an essay that Seamus had, a lecture he had given on Yeats and Philip Larkin, and Philip Larkin's negativity in a poem called O Bad, and that Seamus was highly criticised for saying that Larkin's poem is a great poem, but it fails in the artistic sense of not actually renewing the spirit, the human spirit, as a work of art, he says, should do. You're also talking about that. That sounds like a very interesting book, and the 5 things you mentioned make a great deal of sense to me. So my belief also with the appearance of Pope Francis at the moment is that things are in beautiful chaos, and out of beautiful chaos comes definitely something very good will come. The fact that I have tried to make a whole issue of an Irish poetry journal devoted to Jesus Christ is going to give me a lot of kicks in the backside.
You will be excommunicated from the poetry community.
I know, and still most of them have given me some work, good work. So I think it's part of, I hope, an emerging thing, that people who actually hold something dearly will do something about it.
First of all, John, thank you very much for your talk this evening. I wanted to raise a whole question about whether you call it religious poetry or faith poetry, and the question of aesthetics. It seems to me that one of the problems always with poetry of this nature could be that one looks first to the faith content. Do you see any difficulty in making those kind of judgments? How do the things have to co-inhere, if you like? I mean, say, if you take somebody like Herbert, it seems to me that the two are so closely linked you can't distinguish. You know, you've got a perfect aesthetic piece in a poem like Prayer or in a poem like Love, but you've also got a very supreme sense of what the faith content is about. But that isn't always so, and it seems to me that we can sometimes veer towards looking first to the faith content, and the poem might actually be a poor piece of poetry.
Absolutely, yes. That's the danger with people like Mary Oliver, that in fact if you are repeating the given in some form or other, you cannot really make that personally your own in a work of art, in a work that is poetry. So if you are just rehashing old T-nuts, or even T-nuts that are still held, it will not be art. It will not be good literature. This is why I insisted in trying to make people write from a purely personal perspective. And I specified no doctrine, no dogmas, no church, and a few things like that. A very apathetic sort of a letter I sent out to them. Don't do this and don't do that, but come up with the personal. And it's pretty obvious, I think, most of the time, if somebody is actually rehashing something. Take a hymn like Abide With Me by Newman, for instance. Isn't that Newman? No? Anyway, whoever wrote it, it's got all the T-nuts in it. But it's new. It's different. The approach, the angle is different. So if it's just the old stuff being rehashed, it becomes either a hymn or what you call verse. But it's usually fairly obvious if it's not really a personal response. A poem is a personal response, and it is not something given that you were using for your own ends. It doesn't subserve something else. If it subserves a T-nut, out. It's not a poem, it's not a work of art. I know there's a lot of grey areas in that, but usually it's fairly clear.
We just have time for one more question, and there's a man there who's had his hand up for a while.
John, I just want to ask you a question, and I suppose it's where we come to, if there are boundaries between mysticism and poetry. There is some sense in which poetry is that mystical insight, that mystical vision. I wonder, is perhaps some of the problem in the churches today that the aridity and the almost desert-like quality of it is because there's a death of the mystical and an absence almost of the contemplative?
I think there's a very strong movement towards the contemplative. But the contemplative in our very busy, economically oriented, mechanically oriented, technology oriented world, mysticism just doesn't seem to be possible. So that's what I was saying here, that if we listened more to what's going on around us, and if we listened more to our faith, and if we prayed in the form that the cloud of unknowing, for instance, would suggest, even for a short period every day. If we went to a mass, for instance, where it's not just one thing following another, and even during a communion period, there's hymns being sung, and you're not allowed just to listen to what you've just received. Our world doesn't listen very much anymore. I have found in the odd bit of poetry that has been given to me that it comes after a period maybe of preparation, of work, of study. But the actual poem comes as a gift when you just stop all of this activity in the head and you just listen and wait. You're waiting for Godot, if you like, but Godot comes. And I know that Seamus actually worked a lot like that, that he waited. There's a wonderful poem, a series of poems by Thomas Kinsella, who also has a poem in this anthology, which simply talks about hearing a shuffle among his papers, that there was something happening among his notes. So could he listen to it? And then the poem comes. So I cannot see, unless you go off out into the desert, and even the deserts now are being populated. There will be golf courses in the desert, so you're not going to find a place for mysticism, unless, of course, in beautiful monasteries like Marianella and places like that. Well, there's nothing else to do anyway.
So I feel bad that I didn't give much notice of the last question, so you did have your hand up and I'm sorry. This now would be the last question if you'd like to ask it. And to anybody else who has a question or something that they'd like to raise, we have some refreshments in the far room, so you're welcome to stay and have a glass of wine and talk to one another there. But this will be now our last question.
Okay. John, thanks very much. Wonderful words. I wonder, do you have a saving word to say for prose, for doctrine, for dogma, for theology in the traditional sense? In other words, we're talking about the interface between poetry and theology in a way. One of the people I studied was from Balthasar. He had that very interesting kind of way of saying metaphysics without poetry is dead, and poetry without metaphysics is blind. So he's trying to say they need one another. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the tradition we're coming from, treasures the apophatic but also the cataphatic. You know, can we say things in doctrine, in dogma, in ordinary prose that are constructive and useful and that are complementary, if you like, to the poetic way of seeing things? Or must we stay with poetry to be authentic?
Well, obviously you have to stay with poetry to be authentic. What did you expect to say? I find theology hard to find. The kind of theology that would help me forward at this stage. I just find it very difficult to find anything like that. The most recent one was this Casper, Walter Casper. I had to read him about 4 times though to get him, to understand what he's saying. And if theology was written maybe in a more accessible language, we'd find it easier. I do keep searching for work in prose that will enlighten me further and that will answer questions. But I find that I'm a kind of a magpie and I'm searching for stuff that will urge me into poems. And I keep going back, and the one I go back to all the time is Simone Weil, that she does for me a great deal of, gives me a great deal of inspiration. And she is perhaps the most difficult of all. But then she came out with these, it's Gravity and Grace, that book with little phrases, and I could spend a full day on one of these and maybe think about it so much. And then by waiting and listening, it'll make sense to me. So yes, I do believe that mysticism, theology, poetry, Indian faiths, and anything like that, Buddhism. I have, I think it's 4 poems in this new issue from a Buddhist who does not believe in Christ, but has written 4 very beautiful poems about Christ. So I was trying to cross all sorts of areas in this as well. But again, I couldn't do everything because space is limited and money is limited and so on. But yes, I wish we could get more clarifying and clarified prose to help us along. I mean, poetry is very easy to understand and figure out and enjoy, but it's very hard to enjoy a book of theology.
I feel bad letting you go on that point, but and so thank you very, very much. And please join me.